very much. Ko Ranginui ki runga. Ko Papatuanoku ke raro. Ko Ngāti tangata ke Wanganui. Te he wā mōriora. Ko rangatoto ti monga. Ko motu ihanga ti moto. Ko hauraki ti moana. Ko pupoke ti roto. Ko Burman ti waka. Ko Ngāti Pakia ti iwi. Ko Wakanui ti marae. No Pushpay aho. Ko David Waters aho. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you very much for that applause. I am learning Māori, and this makes me nervous. Welcome. I'd like to also acknowledge my co-presenter, Kieran, who's done a lot of the hard work getting this prepared, so thank you, Kieran. Today, we're going to be going through a hand-picked selection of the OWASP Top 10 and some former members of the OWASP Top 10 unfortunately got shunted down. What we're trying to do here is give you a reason to care, trying to show you what happens or what could happen if your site is vulnerable and what attackers are likely to do, or some of the things they're likely to try and do. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kieran.
Thank you, David. Hello, I am Kieran, also from Pushpay. First of all, cross-site scripting. When we get demoed cross-site scripting, it's almost always in the form of a JavaScript alert box. So something like this, hello world. How does this happen? Cross-site scripting basically is where your site reflects out user content directly on the page. So in this example, if the user types script alert hello world into a form and we post that back directly onto the page, we end up with this. That's well and good. An alert box is, it's not great, but I'm actually not that concerned if that's all an attacker can do. So a better question is, what could you actually do with a cross-site scripting attack? So, yeah, get the right page. I have here a vulnerable website, and I am going to log in. And on this site, I have the ability to set a display name. And I know, because I coded this, that that field is vulnerable to a cross-site scripting attack. So, as you can see, this is not just hello world. Yeah, copy. Paste, save. Doesn't look like it did anything. Oh, we see our name is a little bit weird. But let's say an admin comes along and browses the site now. And when we look at the user list, that display name doesn't have all of that script junk at the end. But we're also not getting a hello world alert box. What's actually happened is it's hooked into this application called Beef. Beef is the browser exploitation framework. And we have this online browser, and this is that admin's session. And there are a whole bunch of tools that are built into this Beef framework that can do some really cool things. So for starters, we'll do a man in the browser persistence. Yeah, where's the button? There's the button. And now every time we navigate, we don't lose that hook. So if I were to browse around the site, we can see in this all of the requests that the user has made. And there are a whole bunch of other tools built into this framework, things like sending network requests on from the user's browser, things that try and attack the browser itself. Some of the coolest ones for demoing are the social engineering attacks. So we can pop up a dummy Facebook login. And if the user were to type in, we get that information back out on the Beef browser. So here we have the username and password that was typed in. So as you can see, there's a lot more that you can do with cross-site scripting than just hello world. What can you do about it? Well, most modern frameworks, for example, in C#, you actually have to be quite explicit when you're writing user content verbatim. So in C#, HTML.raw. In React, they're even more explicit, dangerously set in a HTML. Like that name should be a clue that maybe you want to think about it. There are still times you have to do these. When you are doing this sort of thing, you need to be very careful that what you're writing to the page doesn't contain user content. That's cross-site scripting. Other mitigations, context-sensitive auto-escaping, that's basically what gets baked into you by default if you're using the modern frameworks. We have a few talks I see later on today covering content security policy. That's another good way to reduce the chance of a cross-site scripting attack affecting your site. Next, we have a whole grab bag of these. So the next one I want to talk about is cross-site request forgery. And this is built on the way that the web functions. So browsers by default will send cookies to a site. And most websites use these cookies for things like authentication. So a session token or a forms auth token, they're normally stored in cookies that get transmitted whenever your browser makes a request. A cross-site request forgery attack is where an attacker tricks your browser into making a request to a site that you weren't expecting. That request will include, by default, the cookies for that site. So again, going back to our vulnerable application. It's gone blank.
User list?
User list. Okay, so we see we have two users of our site. We have our attacker, who is just a regular user, and we have our admin. And we're currently logged in as the admin. So a cross-site scripting attack, the easiest way to demo it is if we somehow manage to trick our admin into following a link, maybe through a phishing attack. So this button here, cross-site request forgery exploit, has gone and done something. It's not immediately obvious what. If I look at the user list again, you see our attacker is now an admin. That's probably not a good thing. So what's actually happened is behind the scenes, the attack link contained a iframe, that iframe contained a request, and that request hit the link behind this isAdmin checkbox. So we can toggle this on and off. That makes an AJAX request, toggling whether a user is an admin or not. So what can we do about this kind of attack? One thing that's a bit different about cross-site request forgery from a lot of other attacks is it's not just about not trusting the user. It requires active mitigation on the developer's part. And we normally do this by including a token on the page that isn't automatically sent. So the browser will automatically send cookies. We need to include something that isn't automatically sent along with the request. So we include a token on the page, and on the server we check that those tokens match, and if the tokens don't match, then the request doesn't go through. Again, most modern frameworks will come with a way to do this built in. You just need to make sure you use them. And you also need to protect your AJAX requests. So in this example, we hit an AJAX endpoint. You need to protect all endpoints, not just the AJAX endpoints, but not including them either. David.
Okay, so Kieran has helpfully introduced two concepts I'm going to combine together: cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery. So what we're seeing here is that often two low-severity issues can be combined into one very severe issue. So we're going to start off on our vulnerable web page. And come to a different login form. And when we get our username wrong, we can see that some of our content is being echoed out to the screen. Now, often that's okay, but sometimes people make mistakes when they echo content out. So what I'm going to do here is demonstrate the cross-site scripting using our classical hello world. So what happens if the username contains a script tag? It says hello world. Now that is about as exciting as an alert box, not very. If we were to look at this form, we can also see it's a real simple form with just our two inputs and a submit button. So what I'm seeing here is there's no input type equals hidden cross-site request forgery token. So as an attacker, I would be starting to wonder if this was exploitable via a cross-site request forgery. So what I'm going to try and do is submit this form. So for clarity, this is, when you see the big red banner up the top, this is the bad person's site, the attacker site. So I'm going to try and submit this form from the attacker's site onto the vulnerable site. And we can see it's vulnerable to the cross-site request forgery, and through that cross-site request forgery, we can expose the XSS. So usually when you would see a reflected XSS like this, where the user has to type in and the user gets affected, that's known as a self-XSS, which a lot of people stop caring about because the user can always run code on their own machine. So this is just giving the ability for a user who can run code to run code. Not a big deal. Cross-site request forgery on unauthenticated pages is not as bad because you can't do anything that anyone else can do. So on authenticated pages, as we saw with the user editing, we can use someone else's creds to do this, but on unauth pages, we're not having any creds. So what's the problem with cross-site request forgery on an unauthenticated page? Well, when you've got both those vulnerabilities on the same page, you can do more interesting things. Forgive the colouring here. So this is just getting a little bit more complicated. The last one we saw looked a bit messy and it was clear that the site was doing something wrong. This time when we submit it, the site's looking normal, but we're still running our code. How do we know we're running our code? We've got the alert. Okay, so alert boxes are still not very interesting. So now we've got a slightly bigger scripting block, but what happens, I send a email to a recipient saying, hey, can you please log into your site? There's something you need to do, whether that's change your password or accept terms and conditions or whatever. They come here, we automatically submit this, and they land on this page. They check the URL, localhost 5001, that's the URL they're expecting. They check the HTTPS, well, this is just a self-signed cert because it's localhost demo, but this is the target host, so if this was a proper host, we'd get nice green ticks there. And the form looks fine, right? So I type in my username and password. In this case, it's going to be wrong because I haven't actually got a proper password auth thing behind there. But me as a user, I don't think anything's gone wrong. So that was my normal experience. Me as an attacker, however, so now we're over on the attacker's controlled site, and you can see that that's turned up. I didn't show you this page beforehand, so let's do this one again and say it's for real. And then if we go back to the attacker controlled, we can see the attackers collecting the usernames and passwords off the login screen of the vulnerable site. So we've got two really low severity issues which, if present on the same page, can really compromise your site. This is a compromise of your admin account, and suddenly the attacker can do anything you could do. The mitigations are the same Kieran has talked about. For cross-site request forgery, every modern web framework has a means to do this, but as Kieran mentioned, it is a means you need to opt into. So you need to be remembering to put your tokens into your form and have a filter or whatever your technology calls for every post that is checking for the presence and the validity of the cross-site request forgery token, be that an AJAX request or be that a normal form post. Cross-site scripting, context-sensitive auto-escaping, making sure all your user content is escaped and can't have HTML in it. And it changes where you put that data, what escaping you need to do. So use your frameworks again. Again, all the modern frameworks have this in, and more they're on by default, and you need to work to avoid them. So when you do work to avoid them, because there is a use case, work really hard to make sure that content is safe. The other thing you can do is a strict content security policy. CSP is a really good technology which can help protect your site from cross-site scripting by saying where you expect script to be coming from. And if you say you're not expecting script to be in line and you're not expecting it, and you list the servers where you're expecting your JavaScript to come from, then you're going a long, long way to preventing cross-site scripting on your site, even if you do make a mistake. Okay, we've got a new entrance into our OWASP top 10, XML external entities. I say new, it's been in the OWASP top 100 for a long time, but OWASP as an organisation has had a long look at the top 10, and this has been promoted into it. So what is this? XML is thought of as a data language and a way to transfer data. What a lot of people don't consider is the spec is huge, and parts of that specification include executable code. The two parts that we're going to be interested in today are entity expansion, where you can basically declare variables in XML, and within those variables you can reference other variables, and that can be leveraged for a denial of service attack, which I'll go into. The other thing is you can include other files into your XML document. And if the site isn't aware of this and allows this, it can read any file off that site's hard drive or make network requests from that machine. Okay, demo time again. So where are we? No, that's the next demo. Save your oh, it's a pretty cat. So the first thing I'm going to do is just a non-malicious XML file to see this in action. So we're going to come to our vulnerable site. Okay, so the theory is here, you've got a site and you want to import contacts, and one of the ways you can do this is with a contacts XML file. So clean XML, so this doesn't do anything exciting at all. So we're just echoing out what we found, the first contact we found, in this case, myself. So as an attacker, I start getting interested and I wonder what my next file does. So there's an attack called the Million Laughs attack. So the traditional payload for this is lol. And for those who don't XML, what we're saying is A0 equals lol, A1 equals lol 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 lol, A2 equals lol 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 lol, and then last name equals lol 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 lol. So this is just an attacker seeing if the site is vulnerable. Okay, so we've got the expansion, so we're pretty sure the site is vulnerable. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and get our activity monitor up and look at by name. Please hold caller. Your attention is very valuable to me. Which one is it? I haven't done it yet. Too many .NET processes running. Okay, so CPU load is non-existent, memory load is low as well. So what I'm going to do is a denial of service attack against the machine I'm presenting off. Nothing can go wrong here, can it? Oh dear. So we haven't seen this one yet. So this is just more of the same, but just taken a little further. I don't know, I haven't done the math and worked out how many lols this does and whether I got to the million lols or not. But what I do know is when I hit upload, we can see this is what was being processed in milliseconds is now taking a long time to process. And our .NET, oh, now I know which one it is because it's CPU, it is at 100%. And the memory size is already up to 1.5 gig and just steadily climbing as much as it can CPU. So my CPU is throttled at 100% and my memory is just climbing 1.7 gig. Now, imagine if someone was not quite as polite as me and did this 10 times to your machine, or do you have a big machine? Do you have 32 cores? I could do it 64 times. Now, what else can happen on that computer while I'm doing all this? So we're going to get memory exhaustion, we're going to get CPU starvation, your site's going to slow down to a crawl unless someone stops the request and tries to restart it, and please stop. Okay. Now, we're just going to need to take a little bit for my site to come back up again, and I'm going to kill that tab because sometimes that gets a little excited. Yeah. Okay, so that was a denial of service attack. Now, that as attacks go, it's not the most interesting, but you try and tell that to your boss when none of your customers can access the site they're paying for. So it is definitely worth defending against. If it happens to you, it's a bad day, but at least your user data is fine and all your secrets are fine and no one's compromised your machine yet. Did I say yet? So this is a bit of a contrived example, but bear with me. So in the same way as we could expand variables from text within the file, we can assign contents of files on the network, of files on the hard drive to variables. Now this doesn't need to be just files, this can be any URI, so it can also be network related. Anyway, so what I'm doing here is I'm reading a file, secret.txt, and putting it into ampersand file into the notes field through the reference to the variable. Now in .NET land, this could be your web config. Surely you've got no secrets in there, right? Or your machine config anyway, in case you had a machine key that was encrypting your DB connection string. And in Java land, all your configuration files, your passwords files if you're running on a Linux machine. So you can pretty much read anything that the process has access to. Anyway, let's see this in action. So what did we read this time? We see a YAML file with a DB connection with the server, the database, the username and the password. Strong passwords is always, I see there's a talk later on how to use admin as a password, and your AWS tokens because everyone's in the cloud now. Righty-ho, so that was our compromise. That was reading a file off the local disk. So we'll come back into here. So this is using a sub-part of the XML spec called DTD. And what we really should do is just turn it off everywhere. In modern .NET land, you get that by default. If you just parse a document by the easiest way possible, DTD will be disabled as long as you're, I think that was 4.5.1 or above. I'm not sure. But if you're running the latest and greatest, it's disabled by default. So I actually had to work quite hard to get this vulnerability working in .NET. In Java land, unfortunately, they've gone for insecure by default, so you need to work relatively hard to disable this in Java land. All your default XML parsers will be susceptible to these vulnerabilities unless you take proactive action to turn off DTDs. Okay, moving on to the next, rapid fire. Now this demo is challenging to get working reliably, so if we have to switch to the video, I'm sorry, but we'll try and get it to work. So file injection, a lot of sites need to be able to upload user content, be it your picture, be it your Word doc, whatever else. Lots of sites need to take user content in terms of files. So what can go wrong with that? Okay, you'll be happy to know it is time for the cat. Okay, so in our scenario, we're uploading a profile picture. So we choose File, and we start with our picture of a cat. There we go. Now, I'm in the wrong browser. Excuse me. Let's try that again. Okay, image info. So for those of you with particularly good eyesight, you'll see that the URL includes the file name we uploaded with. As an attacker, I start to wonder if you're just writing the file name I give you in my web request straight onto the disk, which would be a bad thing to do. So let's try that. So we'll start with a proof of concept. Okay. So I'm going to come here and I'm just going to copy that. And so this is what I'm going to upload. So this is my proof of concept. This is a CSHTML file, which is a .NET templated language, and this is server-side executable. So hello OWASP plus this year, and then we output that variable. And we turn on breakpoints. On the right is a proxy called Charles. This is intercepting all local traffic and giving me the chance to modify the request, which is something an attacker can always do. They can always change the network data between themselves and the server. So this is the request. Charles has noticed the request. Let's just make this a bit bigger, sorry. And this is the form that's going up, and it's got a file name 01 proof of concept. I'm going to replace that with ..stroke views stroke upload profiles.cshtml and allow that to go through. Now, what? Didn't work. I'm going to try that one more time and then go back to the video of this working. Okay, edit request, multi-part. Here's one I prepared earlier. Okay. Now, will that go away? So this is the same thing. We're uploading the picture of the cat. We're checking its location. We're seeing it was written, the URL is the same as the file name I uploaded. Yeah, point at cat. It is a cat. Come on, quicker than that. So now I'm going to turn on the breakpoint, so Charles will give me the opportunity to edit the request before it goes through. I'm going to upload my proof of concept. This is the request that would go out. I'm going to edit it, go into the multi-part form, change the file name. And allow that to come through. And now we see hello OWASP 2019. That's what happened the first time too, right? But again, that's pretty boring. So let's try that with a different file. So this is called shell.cshtml. No prizes for guessing what that does, but again, we'll change the file name. We'll send that request through, and now we have a little form. And what happens if we type something into here, like ls or pwd? Where are we? Or who am I? Yeah, or ls. So that is what happens when we allow unrestricted file upload and we trust the user to have put in a good name. Let's quick time, quick. Okay. So just to show you, the file I uploaded was 32 lines, so it's not anything special. And all I was doing, the exploit was having ... in the name I uploaded. And then the server's concatenating together its path with the file name that the user gave, and the user gave a path which overwrote one of the files that was on disk and allowed us to execute. So what can we do to avoid this? Don't trust user-supplied input, and in this case, that comes down to don't persist user-supplied names. So this is all triggered because we trusted the user-supplied names. If you wish to remember the name, that's fine. That's what your database is for. Create a random name for this new file. A GUID will do. Put it on the file system with the GUID, and have a database that maps the user-supplied name with the GUID so the user can download the file with the same name. Don't serve directly off your domain is another thing. There are too many things that can go wrong if your user-supplied files are served off the same domain as your own files. Users can craft things to interpret that file as JavaScript, or like I did, interpret it as executable code on the server. So serve off an alternate domain. In fact, nowadays my advice would be just throw it in an S3 bucket, have a CloudFront in front of it. If you want your own domain, you can map a domain to that S3 bucket and have it like usercontent@example.com or usercontent.example.com. So have a specific subdomain. I'm not AWS centric, so you can do this on Azure or Google Cloud products just as easily. But if I was doing any file upload now, I'd be uploading directly to S3 without letting it touch my servers, and serving directly from S3 without touching my servers. Cool. Now I'm going to hand back to Kieran, and we're going to talk about Bobby tables.
So I imagine most of you will have seen this XKCD comic before. SQL injection. What is SQL injection? SQL injection is just a class of a more general kind of attack called injection. And it's basically where you build up a command to be run by something, and it includes some form of user data. So in SQL injection, you build up a SQL query, and you pass that to the database, and the SQL query is built using some user data. One important thing to note here is that just because you're using a NoSQL database, it doesn't mean you have no SQL injection. So for example, this sort of thing here is what will get you into trouble, where you've built up the SQL query yourself manually, in this case using C# string interpolation. You would know if someone dropped your database, right? what can we actually do with SQL injection? So back on our vulnerable website, we have this page here, and I know this page has some SQL injection because I wrote it. We can sort this table here. This table is pulling some data from a database, and this order by parameter looks a bit suspicious. If we were to throw a quote in there, we get a C# error page. Not very useful, but let's see what we can do with that. Other way. Here we go. So this is a tool called SQLmap, which takes advantage of these vulnerabilities. See if I can remember the command. Force SSL. What was our URL? The URL is slightly different because I'm running SQLmap inside a Docker container.
Excuse me, Kieran, you need a colon after internal before the 5.
Thank you. And I'm also going to cheat a little bit because I know the database we want to target. And maybe I got it around the wrong. There we go. So what SQLmap is going to do is it's going to go and probe that page and see what it can figure out. So it's figured out that it's probably a Postgres database backing there. Now it's going to see whether there's any exploitable parameters on that page. Okay, it found a vulnerable parameter, and it's also pulled back the tables from our database. So we can see here we have that history table. That's the table that was displayed on the page. But there's also this other juicy looking table here called credit card. So I wonder if we can do anything with that. So, SQL shell. We now have a SQL shell we can run against that database. So let's just try select star from credit card. And it's going away and it's using that page and it's pulled back the data from that table. So this made use of that error page, which gave us some feedback. But even if you have a bog standard error page with no feedback provided, SQLmap can still pull back the data. It just falls back to a timing attack and runs a bit slower. Would you know if that happened to you? And what can you do about it? If you're using an ORM, it almost certainly will protect you from this sort of thing. Now, we know that you can't always use an ORM. Sometimes your queries are just too heavy and you need to write them manually. But when you do write a manual SQL query, you need to be very careful with parameters, again, especially user data. Make sure you're using parameterized SQL queries, and that should protect you from this sort of thing.
Sorry for the interruption, Kieran. Someone out the back wall leaning on a light switch. Maybe you could just step away from the wall for a moment. Sorry, carry on.
I think we're done.
What a time for an interruption. So we've presented you with some of the common vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, file upload vulnerabilities, SQLi, and XXE. So hopefully this gives you a bit of an insight into these vulnerabilities if you haven't seen them before, and also gives you a bit more motivation to defend yourself against them, as you can see what the types of things an attacker can do. Do we have any questions? Sorry, Kieran.
Before that, I also want to point out that I'm not an attacker. So a lot of these tools, you can see the tools made this reasonably easy to perform these common attacks. And if I can do it, probably not everyone, but a lot of people will be able to do this sort of thing.
Do we have any questions? There we go. The question is, I talked about CSP and how common is it for defenders to use CSP, and how often the developers come back and say, nah, no thanks. So it's a relatively new thing. It's a couple of years old. It is being widely used, and it is widely supported. It is a pain in the bum to use, especially when you start including third-party libraries who don't give a damn about your CSP. So a number of sites who care a bit strongly about security do use it, and it's becoming more common, and more of the third-party JavaScript libraries are having help documents on what you need to put in your CSP to get them to work. So it is not free. It requires a significant amount of effort to put in. But the coverage it gets is really quite extraordinary. Yeah, the comment is it's easy from the start. Yep. If you're doing greenfields, get it in at the start, and it is easy. Retrofitting it is a lot harder than getting it in. It's still possible. My company Pushpay is doing that at the moment, but it's a long process and it's piecemeal. We're getting one section CSP, so we're targeting the most important sections and prioritizing them and working through it. So it's possible brownfield, but easiest greenfield. Cool. Are we out of...
Thanks, guys. Yeah, you're out of time.
Yeah.
So let's hear it for Dave and Kieran.